Sleep now, and let the thunder of god machines fade into distant memory. Let the trembling of the earth become the gentle rhythm of your own heartbeat, and the flash of plasma fire the flicker of dreams at the edge of waking. This is the story of Mortis, the story of titans that walk to war, and titans that rose from death to walk again. The story of a beacon extinguished, and a wall that would not fall. The story of humanity's darkest hour, and the lights that flickered on even as greater lights went out. The siege had entered its darkest phase. 130 days had passed since Horus brought his armada to Terra. 130 days of unending slaughter, of walls crumbling and men dying by the millions. The traitor host had taken both spaceports now, Lion's Gate fallen months ago, Eternity Wallport more recently, their landing capacity doubled, their forces swelling with every hour that passed. The palace had become a wound in the earth, kilometers of fortifications reduced to rubble and ash, millions of defenders ground down to exhausted remnants who fought on through sheer will rather than hope. The void shields still flickered above the Sanctum Imperialis, creating artificial weather patterns as they recycled the sweat and blood and breath of a civilization fighting for its existence. Rain fell inside the shields sometimes, warm, slightly salty, tasting of humanity itself. Outside the shields, the land had become something from nightmare. Toxic fog choked the air, dense and humid, turning breath into suffocation. The ground was saturated with blood and chemical contamination, a paste of human remains and industrial waste that squelched underfoot. Nothing grew there anymore. Nothing would ever grow there again. And through that wasteland, the enemy advanced. Yet the walls still stood. The guns still fired. And in the deepest chambers of the Sanctum Imperialis, on a throne of gold and agony, the Emperor of Mankind fought his own war against powers that defied mortal comprehension. He appeared, in that realm beyond realms, as a man dying of thirst beneath a dead tree. The desert stretched endless in every direction, baked earth cracked into geometric patterns, heat shimmering on horizons that promised water but delivered only more sand. The tree above him was ancient, its branches bare and bleached white by a sun that never set. Its roots, if it had any, drew sustenance from something other than soil. This was not a real place. Reality had no meaning here, in the space between worlds where thought became matter and more shaped existence. The desert, the tree, the thirst, all were metaphors, the clothing his mind had made for what he endured. Here in the realm beyond sight, there was nothing that was not brought by those that came here. Creatures with eyes like grave coins watched from the darkness at the edge of perception. They were hunched shapes, furred and fanged, with wide laughing jaws that never quite resolved into definite form. Sometimes they looked like wolves, sometimes like something older, something that had existed before wolves evolved, before Earth itself coalesced from cosmic dust. They did not blink but shifted, always just out of clear sight, always waiting. When the sun rose in the sky that was not a sky, they would become mirages, pillars of shadow and false promise in the blinding heat. For now, in this endless night, they simply watched. They had time. Here in the desert that was the world for the man beneath the dead tree, they had all the time that could be. A figure appeared nearby, barely visible in the starlight. He wore a robe of tattered white, holed and trailing threads. He had a stick in his hand, nothing so grand as a staff, just a branch from a thorn bush, stripped of barbs and bark, surface smooth with the wear of hands. His face was young, but his eyes were ancient. "Peace and greetings," said the young man. The man beneath the tree slowly raised a hand in acknowledgement. He tried to speak, but only dust emerged from his cracked lips. "May I draw near?" the young man asked. "I have water." The Emperor nodded, then let his head roll back against the trunk of the tree. The young man came close, knelt beside him, and held up an unstoppered water skin. The man beneath the tree reached for it, tried to grasp the neck. His fingers were too weak. The skin slipped, and the young man caught it. Droplets of water fell from the spout, resting on the ground for a moment like small domes of crystal catching starlight. Then they seeped into the dust and were gone. The young man held the water skin to his mouth. The Emperor drank slowly at first, then desperately, glugging and gurgling the water down with the intensity of someone who had been dying of thirst for centuries. Malcador took the skin away when there was just a mouthful sloshing in the bottom. The Emperor's eyes were dark holes, and there was nothing kind in the grasp that suddenly gripped the Sigillite's arm. I must keep something, Malcador said gently, restoppering the skin. For the journey back, the Emperor, who here was far from an emperor and too close to a god, slowly released his grip. My thanks, he said, but his voice was thin and dry, the sound of dust rattling over half-buried stones. Malcador nodded in reply. He looked at the creatures watching from the darkness, then back at his master. How long? The Emperor asked. How long must I endure? Not long, said Malcador, then shook his head. A little longer. The Emperor let his head rest against the tree. Malcador watched him, and in this place his emotion became a breath of wind, the shadows stirring across his face. I do not know if I can return again, Malcador admitted. The wheel is turning. Things are falling apart. Flesh, will and spirit, all of it. He and those with him are stronger than I dared think. A little longer, the Emperor repeated, his eyes closing. Do you see something? I have looked, but the cards and signs speak of nothing but the call of crows. The Emperor shook his head. There was one card out of place in the spread, Malcador continued. Used in the last reading. The Wanderer, his face turned away, his aspect turned to the lightning tower. There was something in his hand, something held close that I could not see. The Emperor's head came up, and his eyes opened. There was fire where his eyes should be. You must go, he said. Malcador looked up then, at the creatures in the darkness. They were closer now, their silver eyes unblinking, their hunched backs shifting eagerly. The night that had offered brief respite was ending. He straightened slowly, gripping his stick, eyes on the circle of waiting shapes. He looked at the water skin and drained the last gulp of water from it. The skin vanished as he lowered it, the idea of its shape falling as dust. Thank you, said the man beneath the tree. I will return with more. No, not again. There will be no way here. How will you endure? The Emperor did not answer. He simply closed his eyes. You will have to be swift, he said. Go, now. The creatures were moving, the circle tightening. Malcador turned and walked into the darkness, his stick tapping on the baked earth, leaving his master alone with the things that hungered for him. On the Vengeful Spirit, in a throne room that had become something other than a ship's command center, Horus Lupercal received his brother. Perturabo, Lord of Iron, Primarch of the 4th Legion, had come to report on the progress of the siege. He had done everything Horus had asked of him, surrounded the palace, taken the spaceports, ground the defenders down through mathematical precision and overwhelming force. The encirclement was complete, true totality was within reach. But Horus wanted more. Here, the War Master said, his silver claws tracing a line through the holographic display. The razor tip rested on a section of wall sketched in red light. Mercury wall, you shall ring the walls, brother, and Mortis shall walk as one. They shall open our way within. Perturabo's face was stone. An assault there will not succeed. The projections are clear. Wait until the encirclement assault takes its toll and every wall shall fall. They shall reach the wall, and it shall fall, said Horus. His eyes held something that was not quite light, something that burned with a cold fire that defied the laws of physics. Because I will it so. It was not strategy, it was not military science, it was something else entirely, the will of a being who would become more than mortal, channeling powers that cared nothing for projections or calculations. Legio Mortis would walk, the Death's Heads, largest of the Titan legions, first to bow to Horus and the New Age. They had waited in coffin ships in the dark of the void, sleeping and patient. Now their time had come. The ark ships of Legio Mortis descended to Lionsgate spaceport like funeral barges bearing the kings of death to their final battlefield. Each vessel was vast to the point of obscenity, black-hulled and wreathed in frost as they sank into the upper atmosphere. The other ships that had been dumping their cargoes into the docks withdrew back into higher orbits like courtiers, making way for a high executioner. The ark ships came in slowly, holding perfect formation, their descent a ceremony as much as a military maneuver. On the docking platforms, the servants of the Dark Mechanicum waited with the stillness of supplicants witnessing a prayer made real. Some wept corrupted binary, tears of machine oil running down half-metal faces. Some watched with the utter stillness of machines that had transcended the need for emotion. All of the servitors and slaves in the upper docks had been assessed and purged, so that only those worthy to look upon the god machines remained. The Titans emerged from their transport cradles one by one. First came the Warhounds, scout engines, each one the size of a small fortress, their lupine forms stalking down the embarkation ramps with predatory grace. Their weapon pods swiveled and tested, their sensor arrays drinking in the poisoned air of terror. They had been sleeping for months in the cold dark of the void, dreaming machine dreams of fire and destruction. Now they were awake and hungry. Then the Reavers, their humanoid forms towering over the smaller engines, their weapons capable of leveling city blocks with single shots. They moved with the deliberate menace of veteran killers, engines that had walked to war 1,000 times and remembered every kill. Then the warlords, god machines in the truest sense, cathedral-sized engines whose footsteps could be felt for kilometers in every direction. Each one was a mobile fortress, a walking testament to the heights of human engineering and the depths of corruption. Their carapace weapons bristled with apocalyptic potential. Their void shields flickered with contained power that could have lit cities. And at their head, Dicey Ray. The Day of Wrath was an Imperator-class Titan, the largest engine type ever built by the forges of Mars. It stood nearly 60 meters tall at the shoulder, its weapons platforms adding another 20 meters to its silhouette. Its main guns had cracked open hive cities and burned continents. Its void shields could shrug off weapons that would have vaporized lesser engines. Dicey Ray had once walked in service to the Emperor. It had been there at the dawn of the Great Crusade, had helped him conquer the techno-barbarian kingdoms of ancient Terra. It had burned alien worlds and crushed the enemies of mankind beneath feet the size of hab blocks. Its machine spirit had been noble once, proud in the way of ancient kings. Now something else looked out through its eyeports. The thing that had claimed Dicey Ray during the corruption of the Legio was old beyond human reckoning, a daemon prince of the ruinous powers, a being that had existed since before humanity crawled from the primordial seas. It had waited eons for a vessel worthy of its magnificence, and in Dies Irae it had found one. The god machine's gait was different now, its movements subtly wrong in ways that the human eye registered as threat, even if the conscious mind couldn't identify why. Frost formed on surfaces in its presence. Animals died. Mortals who looked too long at its eyeports found their minds unraveling, pulled down into wells of absolute darkness. The column began to move. Tanks and transports fell into formation around the Titans, their engines growling, their treads churning the landing platforms to rubble. Automata walkers clanked along in serried ranks, machines driven by forbidden intelligence, armed with weapons that fused the material with the immaterial. Infantry in their millions marched in the wake of the god machines, corrupted soldiers whose eyes held nothing but emptiness and whose mouths spoke only screaming. Air cover wheeled above them in firefly clouds, fighters and bombers that trailed exhaust like poison smoke, their pilots long since fused with their machines in blasphemous unions of flesh and metal. The vibration of their passage shook the ground for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. On the walls of the palace, sensors registered the approaching host. Distance markers flickered and updated as the column drew closer. 150 kilometers, 175. The defenders prepared to meet them. Legio Ignitum held the Mercury Wall sector. The Fire Wasps, they were called, one of the oldest and most honored Titan legions, born of Mars in the age before the Emperor united Terra. Their engines had walked beside the master of mankind since the very beginning, had helped him conquer the techno-barbarian kingdoms and forge the Imperium from the ashes of old night. They had been there when the Emperor first claimed Mars, when the Treaty of Olympus brought the Red Planet into compliance. They remembered. Now they stood as the last line of defense against their fallen brothers. They called their neural interface the incandescence, not the manifold, as other legions did, but something more poetic, more spiritual. For the Ignitum, bonding with a Titan was not merely a technical procedure, but a religious experience. They believed that the machine spirits of their engines were divine, fragments of the machine god given form and purpose. To walk in a Titan was to be transformed, to partake of something greater than mere flesh or metal. Prince Peps Tetrachoron commanded Reginae Furorem, a warlord Titan whose name meant Queen of Fury. He had bonded with the engine's machine spirit 4 decades ago, had grown from a young Moderatus into a princeps of legendary skill. The connection between them was as intimate as any marriage, deeper than any friendship. When he entered the incandescence, he was not merely a man piloting a weapon. He was something greater, something that partook of both flesh and iron, mortality and eternity. His Moderati shared the connection. Divisia, the weapons Moderatus, was young but talented. Her instincts for targeting and fire control were the best Tetrachoron had ever seen. Cato, the censor moderatus, was older, steadier, his attention to detail the foundation on which their combat effectiveness rested. Together they formed a triumvirate of will, their thoughts flowing through neural links and haptic interfaces, their emotions translated into the movements of a war machine that could level cities. When Tetrachoron closed his eyes and sank into the incandescence, the world transformed. Red was the primary color, the red of forge fire, of reactor heat, of blood and fury. Data scrolled at the edges of his perception in green and gold, target locks and threat assessments and damage reports translated into sensations rather than numbers. He could feel his reactor heart burning in his chest, feel his weapon arms humming with restrained power. The ground trembled beneath his feet that were pistons and hydraulics, armored in adamantium and ceramite. He was not Tetrachoron in this place. He was Regine Furorem, and Regine Furorem was him. The distinction had ceased to matter decades ago. Enemy sighted, Divisia reported, her voice echoing through the manifold like the toll of a distant bell. Multiple contacts, classification Titan scale and greater. Tetrachoron felt the data cascade through his awareness. Target locks painted the approaching engines in crimson, enemy strength assessments scrolling past faster than conscious thought could process. His hands, his engine's hands, tightened on weapons that could crack open mountains. The enemy was coming, and they were not what they had been. The battle for Mercury Wall began with fire from the heavens. Traitor warships in high orbit opened their bombardment at dawn, or what passed for dawn in the perpetual murk that shrouded Terra. Lance beams stabbed down through the clouds, macro shells fell like burning meteors, and the palace's defense network answered in kind. Spears of light burned up through the void shields, stinging enemy vessels, driving them back from their optimal firing positions. Ships died in both directions. The Torment Born was caught by a sustained plasma stream as its void shields flickered open to fire, the beam boring through its hull and into its magazine. The chain of explosions that followed tore the vessel in half, its burning halves falling from orbit to add their fire to the inferno below. Under that apocalyptic canopy, the Titans clashed. Ignatum advanced to meet Mortis on the killing ground between the wall and the enemy landing zones. It was terrain that had once been farmland, then industrial sprawl, then ruins, and was now simply waste
kilometers of ash and rubble, cratered by bombardments, strewn with the wreckage of previous battles. The perfect terrain for Titan warfare.
Tetrachoron led his maniple in a spread formation, void shields overlapping in a lattice of protective energy. The incandescence blazed around him, every sense amplified, every system at peak readiness. He could feel the heat building in his reactor, the hunger of his weapons yearning to be unleashed. The enemy appeared on the horizon like a wave of metal and malice. They were wrong somehow. Tetrachoron had fought enemy titans before, had dueled the engines of a dozen different legions across the galaxy, but these were different. Their movements were subtly off, their gaits jerky and unnatural. Frost formed on their armor even in the furnace heat of the battlefield. The air around them shimmered and twisted, as though reality itself was flinching from their presence. "Fire," he commanded. The Ignatum engines spoke as one. Volcano cannons and plasma annihilators, turbo laser batteries and Gatling blasters, all unleashing in a coordinated volley that turned the air between the armies into a wall of destruction. Enemy engines staggered and fell, their armor melting under the onslaught. But something was wrong with the target data. "Confirm the presence of any shield envelopes on enemy engines," Tetrachoron ordered. The replies came back in rapid succession. Negative, negative, negative. The enemy Titans were advancing without void shields, a suicidal tactic in normal circumstances. No engine should have survived the opening volley without protection, and yet they kept coming. Worse, they were not dying when they fell. Tetrachoron watched in horror as a reaver he had killed dragged itself from the mud. Fire drained into its blackened armor, shattered joints splintered and reformed as they moved. Mud and black water fell from its hull as it rose, and its head came up last, turning to face him with eye ports that held no light, only an absence of light, a darkness that was somehow visible. All engine kills still hostile," he reported, his voice steady despite the cold spreading through his chest. "Engine kills still active. The dead were rising, and they were hungry." The fighting devolved into a nightmare of close-quarters slaughter. Normal Titan combat was a dance of range and firepower engines trading shots at distances measured in kilometers, using terrain and void shields to minimize damage while maximizing kills. This was something else entirely. The corrupted engines pressed close, forcing melees that no sane princeps would have accepted. They didn't care about damage, didn't care about casualties. They simply kept coming, driven by something that cared nothing for tactics or survival. Tetrachoron found himself trading blows with machines that should not exist. A dead Reaver lunged at him, its chain fist screaming, and he caught the blow on his own power fist with a crash that shook both engines to their foundations. Lightning crackled between them as competing power fields interacted. The dead engine's eyes were holes of absolute darkness, and something looked out through them, something that knew him, that hungered for him specifically. He tore his fist free and punched through the enemy's torso, ripping out cables and power conduits, spilling fluid that was not coolant or lubricant, but something thicker, darker. The dead Reaver screamed, not through its war horn, but through the vox, a sound of pure anguish that scraped across his neurons like broken glass. Then another was on him, and another. They were everywhere, pressing in from all sides, their weapons blazing with energies that should not exist. One of them caught a loyalist Reaver in its entropy ray, a beam of pure decay that the Dark Mechanicum had created specifically for this war. Tetrachoron watched as the loyalist engine rusted and crumbled in the space of heartbeats, centuries of corrosion compressed into seconds. Its crew screamed across the manifold as their bodies aged and withered inside their thrones, becoming dust even as their engine became rust. Vortex weapons authorized, came the command from Prince Maximus Sidon aboard Imperius Prima. All engines, clear the fire zone. Vortex missiles, the bitter gift. The Ignatum called them, weapons so terrible that their use signaled an intent not merely to destroy but to annihilate. During the old wars between the Titan legions, the deployment of vortex weapons had been a mark of irrevocable intent, a sign that conflict had passed the point where it could be healed by diplomacy, or even the peace that followed victory. To use one was to expect the same in return. 7 missiles launched from Imperius Prima and its maniple. They flew free, accelerating past the limits of sound, trailing thunder and displacing air with such force that smaller vehicles were knocked aside by their passage alone. The first missile struck and detonated 40 meters behind a Mortis engine. It did not have a precise target, even with the best targeting data. Vortex weapons were imprecise by nature. That did not matter. The mechanism in the warhead ripped a hole in the fabric of reality itself. Darkness beyond darkness, existence screamed as matter vanished into the growing sphere of unreality. Light curdled to neon smears as it fell into the vortex. Sound became something else, something that bypassed ears entirely and crawled directly into the brain. The spheres expanded, consuming everything they touched, titans and tanks, infantry and debris, air and ground. Nothing that entered them came out again. Nothing that touched their edges survived the contact. For a moment, just a moment, the enemy advance faltered. Then Desiree walked through the fire. The Imperator had grown since its corruption, swollen with the power of the things that dwelt within it. Its weapons spoke, and Ignitum engines died. Its presence alone was enough to corrupt targeting systems and drive Moderati mad with whispered promises and threats. Tetrachoron led the countercharge. Reginae Furororum strode forward, power fist igniting with lightning, weapons blazing. He felt the fury of his engine's machine spirit as their own. Felt the ancient hatred that the fire wasps bore for all who had betrayed the Emperor. Dies Irae loomed before him, larger than memory, darker than nightmare. Its eyes were holes drawing light into them, extinguishing it, pulling all that it saw down into an abyss where there was only cold and dark and the slow count of atoms decaying. He saw the fire gathered in the mouth of its gun. His hand rose, the fist of his engine crackling with killing light. He felt the fire touch him, consume him, for the last time, in a moment that stretched for a brief eternity, and then was no more. The Astronomican went dark. No one outside the Sanctum Imperialis knew exactly what had happened. One moment the beacon was there, the psychic lighthouse that guided humanity's ships through the warp, the golden flame that had burned since the Emperor first took his place upon the throne. The next moment it was gone, snuffed out like a candle in a hurricane. Navigators across the galaxy screamed and went blind. Ships in transit were cast adrift in seas of madness, their crews left to die in the endless dark between stars. The reinforcements that Terra had been promised, the legions of Gilliman and the Lion, racing to break the siege, suddenly had no beacon to guide them home. In the rings of Saturn, Admiral Sukasson received the news with the calm of a woman who had already accepted that she would die. The beacon is gone, she reported to the commanders of the fleet that had gathered there, the survivors of the solar war, hundreds of warships hiding in the shadow of the gas giant's radiation belts. Our chances of reinforcement have gone with it. Halbracht, the Imperial Fists commander who served as her liaison to the Legiones Astartes, said nothing. There was nothing to say. Then the Dark Angels arrived. Corswain, Seneschal of the First Legion, had brought 10,000 warriors and 24 warships through the warp before the beacon failed. It was not the army that Terra had hoped for, not the full might of the Lion and the Legion, but it was something. He met with Sukasson and Halbracht aboard the Phalanx, that mobile fortress monastery that had once been the pride of the Imperial Fists. The great ship was wounded now, scarred by the battles of the Solar War, but it remained the most powerful vessel in the Loyalist fleet. "You wish to break through to Terra," Sukasson said. It was not a question. "I do," Corswain replied. "My brothers fight and die on the throne world. I will not sit idle in the dark while they need me. The void between here and Terra swarms with enemy vessels, thousands of them, including the mightiest warships ever built. Your force would be destroyed before you reach the outer orbital sphere." "Then I will die trying." Corswain met her gaze without flinching. "What else remains to us if we leave our swords sheathed and deeds undone for the lack of hope?" Sukasson smiled then, a small expression that transformed her austere features. "There may be a way," she said. "One ship, a weapon without purpose until now." She told him of the Imperator Somnonium, the Emperor's dream, a vessel that had once carried the master of mankind himself across the stars. It was ancient beyond reckoning, its weapons and engines artifacts of a forgotten age, and it was willing to die. "The ship will carry your warriors into the heart of the enemy formation," Sukasson explained. "It will not survive the passage, but it will clear a path. Your assault craft can launch before the final moment, ride the wake of its destruction down to Terra's surface." Corswain bowed his head. "A noble death for a noble vessel." "The noblest," Sukasson agreed. "To carry the angels of Caliban to the soil of Terra, to relight the beacon in its own way." The Imperator Somnium made its final voyage. It plunged through the traitor formations like a burning arrow, its nova cannon blazing, its ancient weapons reaping a harvest of enemy vessels. Ships that had terrorized the void for millennia died in its wake, their hulls split by weapons that predated the Imperium itself. The traitors converged on it from all directions, pouring fire into its failing shields. The great ship burned as it fell, flames streaming from wounds that would have killed any lesser vessel. But it kept coming, kept fighting, kept clearing the path. Corswain watched from the launch bay of his gunship as the distances to the surface dropped. The Imperator Somnium was a smear of fire now, hurtling down through the atmosphere, enemy craft wheeling around it and firing without cease. "Loose," he said, his voice calm. 500 assault craft detached from the dying vessel and fell toward Terra. Behind them, the Imperator Somnium struck the battle barge Wrath's Descent as it rolled over, and the universe turned white. The blast wave swallowed everything, enemy ships, loyalist escorts, the debris of a dozen battles. It struck the Conqueror and the Terminus Est, scarred the flanks of the mightiest vessels in the traitor fleet. In the throne room of the vengeful spirit, the flash lit something in the depths of Horus's eye. And through the fire, through the chaos, 500 craft fell toward Terra carrying 10,000 Dark Angels. The reinforcements had arrived. On Mercury Wall, the situation had become desperate. The death of Tetrachoron and the destruction of Reginae Ferorum had broken the back of the Ignatum defense. Engine after engine fell as Mortis pressed their advantage, their corrupted machines wading through the wreckage of loyalist titans with terrible purpose. But the wall still stood. General Nasuba had rallied the mortal defenders, coordinating fire from the remaining bastions. Blood Angels under Commander Oceano held key positions along the parapet, their presence alone enough to steady the terrified human soldiers. And from the shattered remnants of a dozen Titan legions, something new was being born. Vetherel, emissary of the Fabricator General, gathered the survivors in a cavern beneath the Sanctum Imperialis. Princeps without engines, Moderati without crews, tech priests who had lost everything in the battles above. "I bear the authority and seal of the Omnicia," she declared. "I consecrate here and now the Legio Invigilata, forged from the splinters of broken legions. You shall walk not just to vengeance, but to victory." One by one, the engines stepped forward. Luxor and Victoria, whose princeps had been known as the Great Mother. The survivors of Amaranth and Atyrus and Defensa. Machines whose legions were gone, whose brothers were dead, but whose spirits still burned with the need to fight. In this place, in this time, Vetharel intoned. I call all engines of the Legio Invigilata to walk to war. The noosphere rang with assent and battle cries written in the code of iron and fire. Shiban Khan walked through hell. The Taxir had been lost in the wasteland of Magnificon when Eternity Wallport fell. He had been on a tertiary pylon, salvaging equipment with a work crew, when the communications died and the World Eaters came screaming through the lower levels. There had been no time to reach the garrison, no way to coordinate an evacuation. He had simply grabbed the nearest civilians and run. That had been days ago, or weeks. He had lost track. The fog of Magnificon was dense and humid, thick enough to drown in, saturated with toxins that would have killed any normal human within hours. Shiban's enhanced physiology kept him alive, but only barely. His armor's systems had failed one by one, first the autosenses, then the Vox, then the power assist. He was carrying the weight of his plate on muscle alone now, and his muscles were failing. He carried two mortals with him. Cole was a menial worker, a pipe fitter or something similar, a man whose entire existence had been bounded by the mechanics of fluid transfer systems until the day the war came to his doorstep. He had been helping evacuate civilians from the tertiary pylon when Shiban found him. Now he clung to the Astartes like a child clinging to its parent, too exhausted and traumatized to do more than put one foot in front of the other. The infant had no name that Shiban knew, and Cole had been carrying it when they met, had taken it from the arms of its dead mother, he said, unable to leave it behind. It was small and quiet, wrapped in Hessian sheeting, fed on nutrient paste and prayers. It should have died a dozen times over. Somehow it hadn't. Shiban didn't know why he was doing this. There was no tactical value in saving two random civilians. The war would not be won or lost based on whether one pipefitter and one nameless infant survived. Logic said he should abandon them, move faster, try to reach friendly lines before his body gave out entirely, but logic had stopped meaning anything days ago. There was only the walking now. One step after another, through fog and ash and the rotting remains of millions. The ground squelched underfoot, saturated with blood and chemical waste. Things moved in the murk, shambling shapes that might have been human once, or things that had never been human at all. Shiban avoided them when he could, killed them when he couldn't. His wounds refused to heal. The Laraman cells that should have sealed his cuts and burns were exhausted, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of damage. Blood wept from a dozen injuries, mixing with the sweat that soaked his undersuit. Pain had become a constant companion, so omnipresent that he barely noticed it anymore. Cole talked sometimes, asked questions about the Primarchs, about the war, about what the palace looked like. Shiban answered when he could, grateful for the distraction. The man's voice kept him anchored to reality, prevented him from drifting too far into the grey exhaustion that pulled at the edges of his consciousness. "You have seen him, the Praetorian?" Cole asked. "Yes." "You have been in his presence?" "Talked to him." "Several times." "And the Khan?" "Your Primarch." "Many times." Shiban's voice was a rasp, barely recognizable. "I have spoken with Jagatai Khan since I was young. He knows my name." Cole was silent for a while. "Then what is he like?" Shiban thought about that. How did you describe a Primarch to someone who had never seen one? They were not human, not really, not in the way that mattered. They were something greater, something that transcended the limits of flesh and bone. To stand in their presence was to feel your own smallness, your own mortality thrown into sharp relief. But they were also people, flawed, complicated, capable of pettiness and greatness in equal measure. The Khan laughed easily, loved speed and freedom, grew restless when forced to stay in one place too long. He was a father to his sons, but also a stranger, someone who existed on a plane so far above mortal concerns that true intimacy was impossible. He is. Shiban started, then stopped. How could he explain? He is what we aspire to be, what we can never quite reach. They walked on in silence after that. On the third day, or the fifth, or the seventh, Shiban began to see ghosts. Yeshuge walked beside him, black hair spilling behind, staff in hand. The Stormseer had died years ago, sacrificed himself to save the Khan, but here he was anyway, smiling, speaking words of wisdom in the old Chagorian dialect. "You have come far," Yeshuge said. "Will you not go a little further?" "I thought you had left me," Shiban gasped. "We ride with you until the end, brother." Torgun was there too, and Jubal Khan, and others he had known who had fallen in this war. They rode at his shoulders like the spirit companions of Chagorian legend, the vultures that accompanied lost wanderers, speaking wisdom and truth, keeping them true to themselves. "What waits for me?" Shiban heard himself ask. At the ride's end, what waits for me, brothers? Rest, said Yeshige. Peace, said Jubal. Eternity, said a voice he didn't expect. Camba Diaz rode among them now, the Lord Castellan, the hero of the Pons Solar, who had drawn a line in the stone and sworn that none would pass. He was not White Scar, had never been, but in this place such distinctions meant nothing. They were all warriors of the Imperium, all sons of the Emperor, all brothers in the only way that mattered. You have come so far, Diaz said, his bearded face kind. There is only a little further to go. Shaban's eyes opened. The ghosts faded. He was still walking, still carrying Cole's limp form. The man had collapsed an hour ago, or a day ago, time blurring at the edges. The infant was still breathing, its small chest rising and falling in the sling that held it against Cole's chest. The fog was lighter ahead. Not much, but perceptibly. A slight lessening of the murk, a hint of something that might have been open sky. No backward step, Shaban snarled, baring his teeth at the distance. No, backward step. You hear me, Cole. We will not end here. He didn't know if Cole could hear him. It didn't matter. I am Shaban, son of lightning, brother of the storm. I will take no backward step, no, backward step. Only forward, only toward the horizon. He reached the Loyalist lines at Marmac South as the sun was setting. A soldier named Katsuhiro saw him first, a figure emerging from the fog, huge and armoured, moving with a laboured gait. The troopers raised their weapons, ready to fire at yet another nightmare come to kill them. "Hold," Katsuhiro said. "I think it's one of ours." Shiban collapsed as he crossed the line. The mortals he carried were still alive, barely but alive. A child and an old man saved from the apocalypse by a warrior who had refused to let them die. "Get them to the Medicae," Katsuhiro ordered. "And someone find a blood angel. Tell them one of theirs made it back." Shiban was not a blood angel, of course. He was a son of Chigoris, a White Scar, a rider of the eternal plains. But in that moment, covered in ash and blood and glory, he could have been any of them. He could have been all of them. He was a space marine, and he had taken no backward step. The battle for Mercury Wall continued through the long night. Dies Irae pressed toward the fortifications, its weapons blazing, its presence warping reality around it. The newly forged Legio Invigilata met it with everything they had, engines that had never fought together learning to move as one, princeps who had been rivals becoming brothers in the crucible of war. The wall guns spoke without cease, macro shells and plasma beams raking the advancing column. Knights of House Fironi rode out in desperate sorties, their armigers dancing between the feet of god machines to strike at vulnerable joints and power cables. And overhead, the dark angels fell like avenging meteors, their assault craft screaming down through the poisoned sky. Corswen hit the ground running, his sword already in his hand. Around him, his brothers fanned out, bolters blazing, chain weapons roaring. They struck the traitor infantry like a thunderbolt, carving a path through the corrupted masses toward the wall. For the lion, Corswain roared. For Terra. For the Emperor. 10,000 voices answered him. The wall held. Not easily, not without cost. The defenders paid in blood for every metre of ground, every hour of resistance. Engines fell on both sides, their death screams echoing across the manifold. Thousands of soldiers died on the parapets, their bodies adding to the mountains of corpses that had become the geography of war. But the wall held. As dawn broke over the burning land, a dawn that was little more than a slightly lighter shade of grey in the perpetual murk, the Mortis advance finally faltered. Their casualties had been immense, their momentum broken against the stubborn defence. Dies Irae itself had been driven back, its corrupted hull scarred by vortex strikes and concentrated fire. The enemy was 7 kilometres from the wall, 7 kilometres closer than they had been the day before, but the wall still stood. And somewhere in the darkness above, the Dark Angels were landing. Fresh warriors, uncorrupted by the horrors of the siege, burning with the need to prove themselves in humanity's darkest hour. The beacon had gone dark, but a new light was being kindled in its place. The light of defiance, of courage, of the unconquerable human spirit that refused to surrender even when all hope seemed lost. Sleep now, if you can. Let the thunder of god machines fade into the rhythm of your breathing. Let the screams of the dying become whispers on the wind, and the flash of weapons fire the gentle flicker of stars. Dream of titans that walk to war against the darkness, of walls that would not fall, no matter how hard the enemy struck, of warriors who carried the helpless through hell, and ships that burned themselves to light the way home. Dream of beacons extinguished and beacons kindled, of hope that dies and hope that rises from its ashes. The siege continues. The walls still stand, and somewhere in the darkness, reinforcements are finally arriving. Until next time.